Science Uncut, presented by the Volkswagen Foundation.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, and many thanks for the organizers for inviting me. I want to focus mainly on vaccines, and since the subject has been raised a couple of times, I'll spend a little bit of time on the basic science of protective vis-a-vis immunogenic immunity, just to appreciate that we're talking about something that, in reality, we don't know its mechanism. So the fundamental dilemma for us as a field, basically, we don't know how vaccines work. So consequently, any claims about vaccines, one way or another, need to be substantiated with some science. Otherwise, we are not seriously concerned about the consequences. So there is no question that vaccines are probably the most important preventive measure we as a community, as humans, as scientists, and as public health investigators have in our hands. We have seriously seen that antimicrobials in general have a short lifespan, and quickly you put the pressure of a chemical substance on a biologic system, the end result is clear: resistance. And as much as I love Tamiflu and I love a couple of antivirals that we think that we have, we know that Tamiflu, in the setting of the pandemic of 2009, after giving the first course to children, 10% of the virus coming out of these children was resistant to Tamiflu. So let us just not imagine that we have a miracle drug that we can use. It has a very, very limited, basically very limited span of activity. The facts of life of MRSA and other infections of malaria and resistance says we cannot depend on antimicrobials, antivirals for long-term strategy or policies. Therefore, with the decline in the antibiotic development dilemma that we're all facing, vaccines are the most valuable preventive measures today we have. So we have, in effect, approximately about 30 vaccines we use. But just look at this slide and reflect on 2/3 of the vaccines that you and I, the physicians and the public health in the audience, 2/3 of the vaccines we use are made of the whole organism, inactivated, attenuated, or reassorted. It just says we don't know the antigens in these organisms that are protective. We simply just putting the whole organism and hope for the best. When we came to define molecules, for example, the hepatitis B and the HPV vaccines, they only work if you have adjuvants, and I will get to that in a minute. So consequently, vaccines are as good as they are, but they are not yet a scientific panacea, because we do not, and I emphasize, we do not understand the basis of their function and the basis of their protective capabilities, which makes talking about vaccines for influenza a very challenging issue, and I'll come to that in a minute. So let me then reflect a little bit more on the fundamental basic science of the immune response. And I'm quoting the dual nature here just to reflect on the purpose of this meeting. We actually have two immune responses. One is the response to immunogenicity, which basically says the body of Homo sapiens or of any experimental animal detect the foreignness in a molecule. This immunogenicity we understand in details in a wonderful way, and I'll share that with you in a second. The other response is why in certain circumstances, in certain infections, the immune response has another phase, which is a protective immune response. One of us gets measles as a child, he or she is protected for life. But one of us will get 10 other infections, including flu, and we have no protection beyond a few months or a few weeks. So unless we can differentiate between those two immune responses, we are really mixing two scientifically difficult issues to deal with. So over the years, there is no question, immunologists have successfully managed to examine the immune response, which is the immunogenicity arm of the immune response. So we understand it very well. We understand that upon exposure to a bacterium or to a virus or to any other infectious agent, there are innate immune responses which are dependent on the pattern of molecules on the surface of the invading organism. And these are either toll-like receptors, either the Rig-like receptors, the Nod-like receptors, or the C-type lectins. So let's just take a picture to examine how this functions. Upon exposure to a bacterium, either a heterodimer of the Toll-1 and 4 or the MD2 senses that bacterium and generates a series of intracellular events that are very detailed. We know most of these molecules. They have been isolated, they have been cloned, and they have been expressed in a functional way in many different ways. The end result of that innate immune response is the production of either interferon or cytokines. Some of them are directly lethal to the invading organisms, and some of them initiate the adaptive immune response, which is the other arm of our immune response, where antibodies and T cells play a very important role. So that is the understanding of the innate response. Now, for virus infections, like flu, like influenza, the detection mechanism is dependent on appreciating some sequences in the double-stranded RNA or DNA sequence of the invading organism. And the response is mediated by either RIG or MDA5 molecules. The end result, again, is interferon or cytokines that initiate not only direct killing of the organism, in addition, they initiate the adaptive immune response. So that's what we really know about the immunogenicity response. Now, I'm using a quote here from Ruslan Medzitov because he's one of the major scientists that developed the concept of innate immunity. But he also says what is not known, this is the important statement, what is not known are the rules for the induction of protective immunity. So basically, we don't know. I mean, and this is a very bold and probably a statement that some of you might like to object to or even attack me for. We don't know the mechanism of protection for most of the vaccines that we use. So, because most of the current vaccines that we use are based on the attenuated or inactivated pathogens. As I said, inactivated vaccines, like the flu vaccine, is not really of long, sustained protective responses, and we don't know that. We don't know why that is the case. And most formulations of non-living organisms, whether it is hepatitis B, human papillomavirus, meninge B, and today the cloned hemagglutinin, and in some ways the problem that we are facing with the pertussis, acellular pertussis vaccine, most of these vaccines need an adjuvant. So what do adjuvants do? So adjuvants, and we have for many, many years, depended on one adjuvant, alum. God knows how it was discovered and why it was the only adjuvant we have. At least today, we have 2 more adjuvants that have been licensed. And they were licensed, thank God, for flu. They were licensed under the pressure of the debacle with one season a few years ago when we didn't have enough of the vaccines. So we had to approve the vaccine that is conjugated with the MF59 and the AS02. So adjuvants, a lot of people know, we really don't know the mechanism of adjuvants, how they work. But in the final analysis, they activate the protective immune side of our immune response. The initiation is probably multiple mechanisms. Sometimes it's working on the surface receptors. Sometimes it's working on the endosomal TR receptors. But in effect, it's a mechanism which helps us to get a better immune response from vaccines. Now, let me, for the last few minutes, turn to the current assessment of the influenza vaccines. We have 4 types of vaccines. The inactivated, which most of us use, grown in eggs. This is 2014. My dean, when I first joined the faculty at Case Western Reserve, was one of the 3 who discovered that you can grow viruses on tissue culture. And it is 2014. That discovery was in 1948, as a matter of fact. And that's what got us the 2 polio vaccines. And to this date, most of the flu vaccine that we use is made of eggs, and I'll get to that point why it is actually a barrier to have a decent vaccine for flu. So the process design for a flu vaccine is political as much as it is scientific. So this is a summary of the process design. And I do not intend to confuse you. But there is a secret meeting. It's an unannounced meeting that happens in February and September of every year, that is conducted at WHO, whereby the global influenza system, which are 4 laboratories all over the world, says, along with few other scientists, what is the predictable 3 viruses that will come in the next season. This is in February. And we sit down around the table and say, our imagination is that it is going to be 1 serotype of H1N1, 1 H3N2, and an influenza B virus. And then, from February to September, you get all this mishmash of processes. The end result of it is industry making some vaccines. Now, in some situations, to prepare the seed virus, you have to show that that virus is going to grow in eggs. And if the virus doesn't grow in eggs, the wisdom of that meeting in February says, don't take that virus. So, in spite of the fact that we are claiming that we are predictable based on all these observations, if we face a problem like the virus doesn't grow in eggs, so we can't give you, industry, a seed virus, we don't use that. Now, what are the consequences of that? I'll show you that in a minute. But the fundamental vaccine structure says we're going to make antibodies against the hemagglutinin molecule. And here is a picture of the hemagglutinin molecule and its antigenic sites. Years ago, some of them are sitting in the audience here. Peter is here. They gave us the 3-dimensional structure of the non-cleaved hemagglutinin of the 1918 virus. And next slide shows you the hemagglutinin structure of H5N1. And the structure is very, very similar. So in some ways, we have basically, in spite of the fact that we know the 3-dimensional structure of the molecule, with the exception of the recent work on the antibodies to the stem, of the hemagglutinin. We basically have no clue what that vaccine that you and I take every winter or every fall, what is it working against? We think it is a vaccine that will give you some protection, and the protection is determined by an antibody level to the hemagglutinin, but against what in the hemagglutinin, we have very, very little information. So I will share with you a couple of stories about how that impacts us. So this is the 2007-2008 episode of influenza in the United States. What is on top, the red, that's the influenza A, that is the subtype that was in the vaccine. And why that was determined to be the subtype in the vaccine? Because in the meeting in the early part of 2007, it was determined that the most probable H3N2 virus that will predominate in the season to come did not grow in eggs. So some smart person or persons in that meeting said, okay, just use another H3N2. So what happened is, in that year, CDC reported that most of the influenza, so green is the influenza B, or the influenza that's in the vaccine, and the red on the top is the H3N2 subtype, and in between, all these cases, which were more lethal and more dangerous in the community, were because of a subtype of H3N2 that was not in the vaccine. So that is an example of the mismatch that happened in one real season. This is now real data. I'm not talking about fanciful ideas. This is real data that says you don't mismatch correctly, you get into troubles. So people who say, well, we know this and we know that, they really don't have a feel for the consequences of the vaccine situation. Now, this is happening upon us this year. So CDC just announced that increasing risk of a severe flu season in the finding that roughly half of the H3N2 viruses that are analyzed are drift variants of the vaccine virus that we have this year in the United States. So, I mean, in a fundamental point of view, since we don't know what is the protective antigen, we have a general feel it's the hemagglutinin, but we don't really know the specific epitope, the specific part of the molecule. And we are dependent on predictions. And we're dealing with, as most of you know, an RNA virus that has the ability to drift and change its antigenic structure even within one season. And this was shown even when they sequenced the hemagglutinin of the 2009. As it moved from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, there were changes in the structure of the hemagglutinin. So what I want to end up with is to say that we still have a major preventive tool in our hands, and that is vaccines. In spite of the weakness of the influenza vaccine, because at most it's 60 to 70% protective. But it's not bad under the circumstances that it's a new set of viruses every season. But since we don't know what is the protective antigen, we have not been able to have a universal flu vaccine. We are dependent on this very weak idea that you have to predict, you have to see that the virus will grow in eggs, and then you have to give it to industry and spend 6 months until you collect the enough number of eggs to make enough vaccines. And when it is a pandemic, as it happened in 2009, the total productivity capability of the world is no more than 600-700 million doses. We live in a world of 6.5 billion people. So in effect, the US and Western Europe got the beginning of the vaccine and then started sending some of the extra to some of the poor developing countries. And I don't think this is really a phenomenally good politics or good public health or good understanding of the threat. Thank you very much.